People are going to call this revisionist. Some will say the evidence doesn't hold up. A few academics will write angry comments without finishing the video. That's fine. The discomfort of a challenged assumption is not the same thing as being wrong. Here's what nobody warned you about when they taught you the history of mathematics. The story of numbers, real numbers, positional notation, the zero that powers every computer on Earth right now. That story has a geography problem. The official version places its origin neatly in the Indian subcontinent, radiates outward through the Arab world, and lands in Europe sometime around the medieval period. Clean, comfortable, already printed in textbooks that schools across Asia still use today. But production costs for comfortable stories are high. You pay with everything you left out. What got left out is the maritime world that existed before those textbooks were written, a world of open water navigators who didn't sail by accident. A world where Austronesian-speaking peoples from the archipelago that would eventually be called the Philippines had already built trade networks, astronomical systems, and numerical frameworks that predate the monuments we cite as civilization's starting point. This isn't a claim pulled from a fringe blog. It's a pattern visible in linguistics, in comparative anthropology, in the migration records of the Austronesian Expansion. The pattern points somewhere inconvenient. It points home. Before going further, and this channel earns nothing without your support, if this kind of buried history matters to you, subscribe now. There are 3 more videos in this series that go deeper than this one. Hit the bell. Share this with someone who thinks Philippine history started with Magellan. The Indian Ocean didn't belong to India. That's the first thing a producer of ancient trade history has to reckon with. When you map the actual movement of goods, languages, and knowledge across the pre-colonial Indo-Pacific, the traffic flows in directions that colonial-era historians found inconvenient to document. Austronesian maritime cultures, originating from what is now Taiwan and spreading through the Philippine archipelago outward, were not passengers on someone else's trade route. They were the route. Now pay attention. The Austronesian Expansion is one of the most remarkable human migrations in recorded prehistory. From approximately 3000 BCE onward, populations originating in island Southeast Asia spread across an ocean territory spanning more than half the globe. They reached Madagascar to the west. They reached Hawaii and Easter Island to the east. Well, they did this without compasses, without iron hulls. Using star knowledge, wave reading, and navigational mathematics sophisticated enough to calculate position across thousands of kilometers of open water. You don't cross an ocean by accident. You cross it with math. And here is where the spreadsheet gets interesting. Because when researchers began analyzing the deep structural similarities between Austronesian numerical systems and the positional logic that underpins early Indic mathematical notation, the numbers didn't add up the way the textbooks expected. Linguistic paleontology, the reconstruction of ancient vocabulary through comparative language analysis, gives us a tool that archaeology sometimes cannot. When a word exists in dozens of related languages with a near-identical form and meaning, it's a fossil. A linguistic fossil of something that existed before those languages diverged. Austronesian languages, including the ancient ancestors of Tagalog, Visayan, Kapampangan, and dozens of Philippine languages, carry numerical fossils that predate contact with South Asian civilization. The base 10 positional logic encoded in those systems. When research institutions funded by national governments produce history, the budget line for uncomfortable findings is typically zero. Not zero the concept. Zero the amount allocated to challenging your own civilization's prestige narrative. The irony writes itself. Here's what a careful comparison of the two approaches reveals. On one side, the orthodox Indic narrative, which places the Brahmi numerical system and the conceptual zero within a continuous South Asian intellectual tradition, supported by inscriptions, manuscripts, and a formidable academic infrastructure built over 2 centuries of scholarship. On the other side, a dispersed, underfunded body of comparative work drawing on Austronesian linguistics, maritime archaeology, and the genetic record of population movements across the Indo-Pacific. One side has the infrastructure, the other side has the data. Wait a second. The Laguna Copperplate inscription, discovered in the Philippines in 1989 and dated to 900 CE, demonstrated something that shocked the mainstream scholarly world. Here was a document from the Philippine archipelago, written in a script derived from the Indic Kawi tradition, using a calendrical and numerical system that showed sophisticated integration with Old Malay and Sanskrit frameworks. The document wasn't a primitive artifact. It was a record of debt forgiveness, a financial instrument, a spreadsheet essentially from the 10th century. Bureaucrats understand debt instruments. When historians saw that plate, some celebrated the evidence of Indianization. But a different reading is possible. What if the traffic wasn't one-directional? Important. The Kawi script reached the Philippine archipelago, but the numerical sophistication already present in the archipelago's trading cultures shaped how that script was adapted and used. The synthesis wasn't colonization of an empty intellectual space, it was a merger of 2 already developed systems. Mergers have 2 parties. Wait a second. The Maritime Archeology backs this up in ways that are still being processed. The boat-building traditions of the ancient Philippines, the balangay, the parao, the large ocean-going vessels documented in Chinese records from the Tang Dynasty period. These were not simple fishing craft. They were precision instruments. Building them required mathematical planning for load distribution, timber stress, water displacement, and celestial navigation. That knowledge existed in the archipelago before the first Sanskrit loanword appears in the linguistic record. And here's the detail that keeps coming back. The particular way ancient Philippine numerical systems handled the transition between orders of magnitude, the cognitive jump from tens to hundreds to thousands, maps onto the same structural logic that appears in early Indic positional notation. Not approximately, structurally. The question isn't whether a connection exists. The question is which direction the current was flowing. 500 years of colonial documentation trained everyone to assume the current flowed toward the archipelago. Everything civilizing came from outside. Everything original came from somewhere else. That assumption was never neutral. It was productive. It produced compliance. But the compliance had a price, and someone paid it. The price was the erasure of the pre-colonial intellectual tradition so thorough that even Filipinos today often genuinely don't know that their ancestors were producing written financial records, navigating by star mathematics, and participating in one of the ancient world's most sophisticated trade networks centuries before Europe had a single university. That gap isn't ignorance. That gap is the product of a very deliberate budget decision made by colonial administrators. What you don't teach, people don't know to ask for. Here's the contrast that cuts deepest. Moving on. The Indian subcontinent preserved its intellectual heritage through institutional continuity. Universities at Nalanda and Takshashila. Manuscript traditions maintained through centuries of political upheaval. The mathematics of Aryabhata and Brahmagupta survived because institutions survived. Because someone funded the copying of texts. Because prestige was attached to the preservation of knowledge. All right. The Philippine archipelago had no equivalent institutional continuity through the colonial period. The Spanish burning of pre-colonial documents wasn't an accident of history. It was policy. A production decision, if you think about it, in terms of what the colonial project was manufacturing. The product was a population that understood its history to begin at baptism. When you destroy the archive, you don't destroy the knowledge, you destroy the proof. And the absence of proof became, over centuries, proof of absence. That's the trick. That's the mechanism. Not a conspiracy hiding in classified files, something simpler and more brutal. Systematic underfunding of memory. The most effective censorship doesn't burn books dramatically. It lets the institutional budget for preserving them quietly hit zero. But there are things you cannot burn. Truly cannot. Language. The structure of words, the mathematical logic embedded in how a culture counts, groups, and names its numbers. Those survive in the mouths of people even after the manuscripts are ash. The linguistic evidence isn't going away. The genetic migration data connecting Philippine ancestry to the populations that shaped the earliest Indo-Pacific trade networks isn't going away. The maritime archaeology slowly emerging from Philippine coastal sites isn't going away. Each piece, individually, can be dismissed. Together, they describe a picture that requires either engagement or deliberate avoidance. Delhi has chosen avoidance. The question is whether Manila will choose engagement. Because here is what this is actually about, past the academic argument. The Filipino community, diaspora and domestic, is one of the most globally distributed populations on Earth. Millions of Filipinos interact daily with the mathematical and technological infrastructure that traces its conceptual origin to ancient numerical systems. They use it to send remittances, to write code, to study medicine, to run businesses. They use it without knowing they may have helped build its foundation. That's not a small thing to sit with. The research is moving, the scholars are young, the data is accumulating from sites across the archipelago that weren't excavated a decade ago. And there's a generational shift happening right now in how Southeast Asian history is being written, not by European institutions with colonial assumptions baked into their methodology, but by Filipino, Indonesian, and Malaysian researchers bringing different questions to the same evidence. Different questions produce different answers. But there's a detail. The answer emerging from this new wave of scholarship is not comfortable for the established narrative. But the established narrative was built on a budget, built with specific interests in mind, built to produce a world where certain civilizations sat at the origin point of knowledge, and others were recipients. That budget is running out. And what comes next? What the next decade of Indo-Pacific archaeological work is likely to surface about the actual flow of mathematical knowledge across the ancient maritime world is going to require a reckoning that goes far beyond a YouTube video. This is the part where the story should end with a resolution, but the resolution isn't written yet, because the most significant excavations in the ancient Philippine coastal sites linked to pre-Indic contact periods are still ongoing. And one of them, one specific site that a research team declined to name publicly until the findings are peer-reviewed, has turned up something that, if verified, would force a rewriting of the contact timeline between Austronesian maritime cultures and the early Indic mathematical tradition by several centuries. Several centuries. If that timeline shifts, the question of who taught whom doesn't become ambiguous. it becomes answered.